The good old Geneva Convention has regulated the protection of asylum seekers since 1951, but Britain's Home Secretary Suella Braverman wants to reform it. She would restrict the right to asylum. Of course, because Britain's Conservative Home Secretary Suella Braverman has questioned the United Nations Refugee Convention. Politicians need to consider whether the convention and the way it is interpreted by the courts are still suitable for our modern times or in need of reform. That's what she said on Tuesday while visiting a think tank in the USA. The UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, rejected Braverman's calls for reform. And Braverman said while visiting the American Enterprise Institute, "There are large parts of the world where it is extremely difficult to be gay or a woman. Where individuals are being persecuted, it is right to give them protection. But we will not be able to maintain an asylum system if it is enough for you to be gay or a woman and fear discrimination in your country of origin to be entitled to protection," she said. The Geneva Refugee Convention of 1951 is a cornerstone of humanitarian international cooperation. It guarantees admission to people who are being persecuted in their country because of their religion or political beliefs, for example. People must not be sent back to places where their lives or freedom are threatened. And as I said, the UNHCR objected to Braverman's request, and they said, "There is no need to reform or a more restrictive interpretation, but for a stronger and more consistent implementation of the Convention and its fundamental principle of responsibility sharing." The Refugee Agency recognizes the complex challenges posed by irregular movements of refugees, which often take place together with migrants who are traveling for other reasons. But the Refugee Convention remains as relevant as it was when it was adopted, said a UNHCR statement. Braverman takes a tough line against migrants, we all know this, and quite a new British law makes it possible to immediately detain migrants who cross the English Channel to the British island in small boats. And then people should be deported to their home country or a third country without the opportunity to apply for asylum, and critics speak of an abolition of the right of asylum. According to the government's wishes, migrants should be able to be sent to Rwanda, among other places, regardless of their origin. However, an agreement that has already been concluded with the East African country is indeed on hold due to legal dispute. But this whole discussion, which Braverman keeps stirring up, is actually only intended to distract from the real problems in Great Britain, often caused by this government. The inflation crisis in Britain, for example, could increase the number of premature deaths, as we know now. The trade journal BMJ Public Health published a study according to which the number of people who die prematurely and therefore before their 75th birthday could increase by 6.5% because of the high prices. The poorest households suffer a 4 times higher number of premature deaths than the richest, it said. Poorer households would have to spend proportionally significantly more of their income on energy products, for example, which have recently been quite expensive. And overall, inflation was 6.7% in August. This means that the situation has eased somewhat, but inflation is still the highest among the G7 countries. And the reason for this are the corona crisis, but of course also the consequences of Brexit and the war in Ukraine. For the analysis, the researchers examined the effects of high prices on the number of deaths in the period from 22 to 23 in Scotland with and without relief measures. They used this data to create future scenarios for life expectancy and inequality in the UK. And the results were, without help, for example, through government relief measures, inflation could increase premature deaths by 23% in the poorest households and 5% in the richest. With relief measures, the numbers fall to 8% and 2% respectively. On average, there is an increase of 6.5% for the population. The researchers concluded that the economy plays a role in the health of the population. The government's current responses to the cost of living crisis are not sufficient to protect the health of the population and prevent growing inequality. But British doctors are also sounding the alarm elsewhere. Victorian-era diseases such as tuberculosis spread to many areas of Britain. The state health system has apparently not been able to put a stop to this so far. General practitioners' practices and clinics in the British National Health Service, the NHS, report that more and more patients are coming to consultations with previously undetected tuberculosis. More than 2,400 new tuberculosis infections were reported nationwide in England in the first half of 2023, according to official statistics. This is a further increase of 7% compared to the previous year, when the numbers were already relatively high. According to the London Ministry of Health, the highest growth rates were reported in the southwest of England, where tuberculosis infections increased regionally by 62% compared to the previous year. In the northeast, the number of reported cases of the disease rose by 51%, and in wealthy southeast of England by almost 15%. But that brings us back to the study I mentioned earlier. Just for comparison, according to information from the Robert Koch Institute on September 21st, 3,227 tuberculosis infections have been reported in Germany since the beginning of the year. In the same period last year, there were 2,991 reports nationwide, and we are 85 million here. NHS GPs report that many patients know little about this and other diseases dating back to Queen Victoria's time. The infection is often diagnosed by chance because the patient comes to the consultation because of other complaints. Socially disadvantaged families are significantly more likely to be affected by tuberculosis than wealthier families. And other diseases from Victorian times are also making a comeback, according to doctors in Britain. This trend was accelerated by the corona pandemic, as many patients avoided clinics and overcrowded waiting rooms in primary doctors' offices for fear of infection, and some still do so today. Whether scarlet fever or whooping cough, the number of reported cases has also increased there. At the same time, state clinics and doctors' practices have long been under pressure to treat more and more patients with fewer and fewer staff and resources. And this inevitably encourages the spread of these diseases. And the staff shortage is once again having an impact somewhere else as well. Anyone flying through Gatwick Airport this week will need strong nerves. Numerous flights were cancelled due to a lack of staff. And the reason for the sudden understaffing? Many sick reports, including due to corona infections. We learned about the new variant in Britain. And anyone flying through Gatwick Airport this week will, as I said, need strong nerves because numerous flights were cancelled due to the lack of staff. And let me come back to this. The maximum of 800 flights are now planned daily until Sunday. And that's around 30 to 65 fewer flights on individual days than actually planned. And Gatwick Airport, located south of the British capital, is the second largest airport in Great Britain after Heathrow. But it's not just Braverman's distractions with migration that the Tories are using to look ahead to the next election and cover all these other problems. Climate policy is now also viewed in a more populist manner, so to speak. Last week we talked about this. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak threw out his country's two most important climate regulations. And it doesn't take a prophet to make a connection between the Tories' dismal poll numbers with the prospect of losing the next general election and this decision. Sunak postponed the sales ban that was supposed to apply to cars with combustion engines from 2030 by 5 years. Furthermore, the Prime Minister is also backtracking on the plan to encourage homeowners to install heat pumps from 2026. Oil and gas heating systems, which were originally scheduled to be phased out gradually from 2026, can now be installed without restrictions until 2035. Sectors that account for more than half of British CO2 emissions, that's transport with 34% and buildings with 17%, are no longer subject to any regulations for the time being. But the weakening of climate protection rules in response to poor survey results and as a means of supposedly promoting the economy cannot only be observed in Great Britain. The German federal government also wants to change the Climate Protection Act. The two largest sources of emissions, transport and buildings, which have not yet met their requirements, should be able to offset the savings from other sectors in the future. This reduces the pressure for transformation and with it the probability that emissions will actually decrease. And they are having poll numbers like you know. Robert Habeck is also moving away from the technical standard EH40, which stipulates that new buildings only require 40% of the primary energy compared to a standard building. And even supposed pioneering nations like Sweden are rowing back now. The Swedish government announced rather casually that the country was questioning the 2030 target of reducing emissions in the transport sector by 63% compared to 1990. So if one starts, they all come out. As understandable as it is that politicians under pressure make decisions that are popular with voters, this thinking is misplaced in the case of climate protection regulations. What creates relief in the short term not only endangers the net zero target for 2050 in the long term, but also indirectly harms companies trying to transform, a point that generally receives little attention. And so the strongest criticism of Sunak's U-turn came from British car manufacturers and the manufacturing industry as a whole. According to the Make UK Association, 68% of manufacturing companies have already invested heavily in transformation. Another 22% plan to do so in the coming year. And 92% of British companies say the transformation to climate neutral business is very important for their business. And this example should be a reminder not to underestimate how much companies have already adapted to climate goals. Laying hands on this leads to distortions of competition and punishes the drivers of change. And nothing different applies to companies in the logistics industry. It would simply be unreasonable to reduce the pressure for transformation, not only because the players in international competition would be weakened, but also because the restructuring of business models that has long been accepted and pushed forward would be jeopardized. So, for different reasons, in some cases, they are endangering what's happening. There's a difference between the reasons for the British government and the German government. The German government messed around a lot when they brought the law up that is now in place. And they still have very poor poll numbers and trying to work on this. And on the other hand, the people are so angry about our government that they also are saying they would give their vote to extreme right-wingers, or I would even call them fascists. But in the UK, Sunak is definitely doing this to make his poll numbers better after seeing what happened in Uxbridge. And they could hold Boris Johnson's old seat because of ULIS. So there's a lot covering up, but that's another reason why there's another video right now here in the end screen, and I'll see you there. I'll be back.